Rain slammed against the skyscraper, a relentless percussion. The city blurred behind a sheet of water. Lightning split the sky, sharp and fleeting. Alexander Vale stood alone. At the edge of his office, 72nd floor. Glass walls on every side. The city sprawled beneath him like a living map of power and possibility. He lifted a glass of whiskey. Amber liquid caught the light. The smell of oak, of smoke, of something older than memory. He swirled it, listening to the storm. The hum of the air conditioning. The distant tick of a clock. Everything so loud, and yet so empty. To the world, he was untouchable. 38 years old. Billionaire. CEO of Vale Industries. Man who could make or break entire markets with a single word. People said he was born for this, destined, invincible, but that was the story they told themselves, not the one he carried in silence. He remembered the beginning. The small office he shared with two other dreamers, faded carpet, peeling wallpaper, the constant smell of coffee, a single flickering fluorescent light overhead, buzzing, watching, judging. "You can't do this alone," "Alex," said his friend, voice low, almost trembling. "Trust me, nobody makes it here alone. You'll need something else." Alex had smiled, a thin, practiced smile. Inside, panic clawed at him. The fear of failing, of mediocrity, of watching others, less skilled, less hungry, grab the life he dreamed of, and then it appeared. An opportunity, a temptation, a choice that would define everything. The stranger waited in a dark hallway. Long, after the offices had emptied, shadows curled along the walls. The man's presence made the air colder, heavier. "You're ready for more than luck, Alexander," he said, voice low, measured. "Everything comes at a price. Do you understand?" Instinct screamed, caution screamed, but desire roared louder. Ambition, the need for certainty, control, victory. "I understand," Alexander said. The stranger smiled, a smile that didn't reach the eyes. A small folded note pressed into his hand. No instructions, no promises, only words. "Follow this path. Once it begins, it cannot be undone." Alexander studied the city below. Rain streaked lights. Thunder rolled, a storm both outside and inside him. That night, he made a decision, a choice that would ripple through every deal, every triumph, every regret. The world outside saw a man of confidence, of control, sharp suits, perfect smiles, headlines praising brilliance, investors eager to be near him. And yet inside, Alexander carried a secret, a seed planted in shadow, a silent force guiding him forward. Deals that once seemed impossible suddenly aligned. Doors opened that should have been locked. Investors came to him, seeking him, not the other way around. Each step felt like inevitability, like the universe itself was bending to his will. But the memory of the stranger lingered, low, persistent. Once it begins, it cannot be undone. Alexander didn't yet know the full cost, not the sacrifices, the compromises, the silent, unseen toll. He raised his glass again. Lightning flashed, the storm raged, the city sparkled, and for the first time, Alexander Vale felt the weight of a life that was no longer entirely his own. The first step was small, almost imperceptible. A handshake in a quiet hallway. A folded note, instructions too vague to make sense. Alexander stared at it for hours. The ink seemed alive, shifting slightly, teasing him. "Follow this path. The rest will follow. Nothing more. No explanation. No hint of the cost." He tried to ignore it at first. Told himself it was just another business tip, a lucky coincidence dressed as advice. Yet, something deeper whispered in the back of his mind. A voice that refused to be silenced. He unfolded the note again. The instructions seemed almost ritualistic. A series of actions, each small, almost meaningless on its own, yet somehow, together, they formed a blueprint for power. "You're serious about this?" asked Julian, his oldest friend and co-founder, the night Alexander first told him. Julian leaned back in the worn leather chair, smoke curling from a cigarette. "Because it sounds weird, dangerous even." Alexander smiled, a a small, tight smile. "I don't know if it's danger or opportunity," he said. "Maybe both, but I have to try." Julian frowned. "You don't even know what it is. You're following instructions from some stranger." "I know enough," Alexander replied. He watched the rain streak the windows, the city lights flickered in 100 different shades, and he imagined the doors this agreement could open. At first, the effects were subtle. Minor coincidences, a meeting scheduled at just the right time, a competitor hesitating just long enough, a contract that slipped through the cracks, landing perfectly in his favor. He convinced himself it was skill, intuition, luck. Yet, slowly, the patterns grew undeniable. One morning, a potential investor rejected him outright. Alexander followed the instructions on the note. Within days, the investor called back, eager, persuasive, desperate. To join, he began to notice small ripples everywhere. Employees who seemed loyal suddenly betrayed him. Partners who appeared supportive quietly undermined him. The timing of events, minor, almost invisible, shifted, as if unseen hands were nudging the pieces of his world into place. A subtle fear began to creep in. Not fear of failure, fear of the unknown, of the price he had not yet seen. "Alex," Julian said one night, voice tight with concern, "I think this isn't just luck. There's something else, something you can't control." Alexander didn't answer immediately. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and watched the storm outside. "Maybe you're right," he said finally. "But if it works even half as well as it promises, then nothing will stop us." And the pact worked, better than he could have imagined. Deals slid into place. Opportunities arrived at impossible moments. Competitors faltered without warning each. Success fed the next. The empire grew. Alexander's name became synonymous with brilliance, fearlessness, inevitability. Yet behind the veneer he felt a constant tension, a shadow that whispered, even in moments of triumph, questions that refused to be quiet. Who else is affected? What am I giving away? When will it demand payment? He tried to rationalize it. Every man who achieves greatness makes sacrifices. Every empire is built on compromise. But this was different. It wasn't visible. It didn't announce itself. It moved silently, shaping his life in ways he couldn't yet see. He began to notice the subtle shifts in people, a partner who suddenly became greedy, a friend who hesitated at critical moments, a rival who stumbled, just enough to make Alexander look brilliant. It wasn't coincidence, not anymore. And yet, it wasn't overt manipulation either. It was invisible, patient, persistent, like roots growing beneath a stone wall, quietly reshaping the structure. Alexander began to wonder about the stranger. Who was he? Why him? What did he gain from all of this? But every attempt to investigate ended in frustration. No trace, no explanation, only the note, folded and worn, waiting silently for the next step. "You're different," his sister said one evening over dinner. "You move in ways I can't understand. You've changed, Alex. You're not the same." He didn't respond. He didn't tell her. How could he explain a force he barely understood himself? A secret, invisible, that controlled more than just business. It touched every aspect of life. And still, Alexander followed it, step by step, instruction by instruction, because the rewards were too tangible to ignore. The empire grew. The world celebrated him. And yet, a small, quiet voice inside refused to be silenced. A voice that knew the pact was patient. It waited, watching. And Alexander, for the first time, realized he was no longer the master of his own life. The note's words echoed in his mind. Follow this path. The rest will follow. And somewhere deep down he wondered, follow it to what? The consequences began quietly. So quiet that at first, Alexander barely noticed. A shift here, a hesitation there, minor details that seemed accidental. Yet over time, patterns emerged, like shadows forming shapes in a dim room. It started with a deal, a major acquisition, years in the making. Alexander followed the instructions on the note precisely. Every call made, every email sent, every handshake timed perfectly. The deal fell into place with an almost supernatural precision. Yet, in the back of his mind, unease stirred, because the deal had consequences he hadn't anticipated. A competitor who had once been loyal suddenly withdrew support. A trusted advisor questioned him in ways that felt pointed, personal small tremors, subtle shifts, but unmistakable. "Alex," said Julian one night, leaning over the conference table, voice tense, "I don't like this. It's too clean, too perfect. Something feels off." Alexander studied him. He wanted to reassure his friend, to brush it off with charm. Instead, he said quietly, "Sometimes, Julian, the world just aligns, that's all." But even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't that simple. Over the next months, the Pact's influence became undeniable. Minor choices, choosing a lawyer, hiring an assistant, agreeing to a casual meeting, echoed into massive outcomes, opportunities, arrived at the precise moment he needed them. Competitors faltered exactly when he required space. Mistakes that could have ended him simply didn't happen. It was like moving through life with invisible rails, every step guided, every decision subtly manipulated, and every success came with a gnawing question: at what cost? Alexander began noticing the toll it took on the people around him. Partners who had trusted him wavered. Employees who had admired him quietly resented him. Even family, those closest to him, felt the strain. "Alex, you're changing," his sister said one evening. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Something's different. You're distant." "I'm fine," he said, though his chest tightened with guilt. How could he explain a force no one else could see? A pact that demanded obedience, a shadow that guided every choice. It wasn't just business anymore. It had crept into life itself. The empire continued to grow. Headlines hailed him as a visionary. Investors sought him out. Competitors feared him. Governments courted him. Yet in the silence of his office, Alexander felt the weight of invisible strings. The world saw brilliance. He felt something else entirely. Late one night, alone, he traced his path on a whiteboard. Deals, acquisitions, hires, betrayals, wins, all marked in neat, precise lines. And then he noticed the pattern. Not random, not coincidental. Directed, orchestrated. The realization hit him like ice water. Every major decision, every pivotal moment, had been shaped by something outside himself. The Pact had not just assisted him, it had guided him, and worse, he understood that the influence would never stop. Every triumph, every misstep, every relationship would now be measured against the invisible rules he had agreed to follow. Freedom, he realized, was an illusion. Control was a carefully crafted story, and the cost was beginning to appear. "You look tired," Julian said one evening. Concern sharp in his eyes. Alexander smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Tired doesn't begin to cover it," he admitted. "And yet, I can't stop. Not now, not when it's all aligned." The subtle manipulations grew bolder over time. A rival who had publicly challenged him faced sudden setbacks. A minor miscalculation in his favor shifted entire markets. It wasn't luck, it wasn't skill, it was something else entirely. He began to see the ripple effect. Everywhere, the Pact was patient. It worked quietly, leaving him to believe he was in control. But control, he realized, had never been his. It was borrowed, lent by the invisible force he had agreed to obey, and still, the rewards were intoxicating. The empire grew beyond imagination. The world worshipped him as a man of unmatched vision. Yet in the quiet hours, Alexander faced a gnawing truth. The power he wielded was not entirely his own. Every choice, every opportunity, every triumph carried a hidden weight. The ripple effect of the Pact had begun to touch everything. The storm outside mirrored his inner turmoil. Thunder rolled in the distance. Rain streaked the glass. The city shimmered below, beautiful, alive. Indifferent, Alexander raised his glass, staring down at the reflections of a life he had never fully controlled. He realized that he was not just a master of business. He was a pawn in a game that had begun years ago, with a handshake, a note, and a promise, and deep down, he knew the real challenge was still to come. Success came at a price. Alexander Vale learned that slowly. first in whispers, then in undeniable waves. The boardroom lights were cold, fluorescent, unforgiving. His assistants moved with quiet efficiency. Investors smiled, teeth bright, eyes calculating, and yet, in the spaces between their words, Alexander felt the absence of something he couldn't name. He remembered his early years, the nights spent in cramped offices, the smell of coffee thick in the air, the laughter of friends who shared his dreams. Those friends had faded. Some betrayed him, others simply drifted away, unable to keep up with the pace of the empire he now commanded. "Alex, you're different," his sister said one night. Dinner was quiet. The city outside flickered in distant lights. "You don't laugh the same. You don't feel the same." He stared down at his glass of whiskey, amber liquid catching the dim light. "I know," he said softly. "I've changed. I had to, and he had." Every triumph had been purchased with sacrifice. Every victory came with moral compromises, some so small they seemed insignificant at first, until the consequences built, stacked like bricks in an invisible wall. The Pact demanded subtle obedience, every action guided, every choice measured. And slowly, Alexander realized that life itself had become a negotiation with an unseen force. He missed dinners he wanted to attend, he missed calls from old friends, he missed moments of laughter that once defined his existence. Romance had become calculation, trust had become conditional. One evening, Julian confronted him again. They were in Alexander's office, the city glowing behind them. "Alex," Julian said, voice low, "I can't recognize you anymore. The man I knew, he didn't move like this. He didn't—" "Shh," Alexander interrupted, holding up a hand. "I know, I see it too, but it's too late now. You don't understand." Julian shook his head. "I want to understand, but you won't let me. You've let this pact change you," Alexander didn't answer. Not fully, he couldn't, because even he didn't yet understand the full cost. The empire expanded relentlessly, Vale. Industries became more than a company. It was a machine that produced wealth, headlines, admiration, and loneliness, quiet, unyielding loneliness that settled in the pit of his stomach like ice. Every relationship strained under the invisible weight of decisions he no longer fully controlled. He began avoiding family events. He skipped birthdays, even simple, ordinary dinners became tactical calculations. And the Pact, it never relented. It waited, patient, unyielding. Every gain demanded attention. Every success required more sacrifice. Alexander began to recognize the pattern. There were nights he sat alone, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioning, the soft patter of rain against the window, and wondered whether it had all been worth it. A love he once hoped for had faltered. A friendship he cherished quietly decayed. Even his own reflection felt foreign. The man staring back from the glass was polished, sharp, untouchable, but hollow. "You've changed," his sister said again, voice trembling. "Everything about you. It's not you anymore." He nodded, a lump in his throat. "Yes," he admitted. "I've changed. But the world demanded it. The realization was unbearable. The wealth, the power, the empire, they were all real. But freedom, connection, innocence, those were gone." Alexander remembered the stranger's words, faint but ever present. Once you touch it, you cannot let go. He finally understood. The Pact didn't just shape opportunity, it demanded allegiance, it demanded life. And Alexander Vale, master of billions, king of boardrooms, visionary to the world, was no longer fully his own man. He had everything, and yet he had lost something far more vital. He stood in his office late one night, staring out at the storm. The lights of the city mirrored the flashes of guilt and regret in his mind. Every triumph tasted faintly of compromise. Every accolade echoed with the sound of solitude. And yet, despite the cost, he couldn't stop. The empire required him, the Pact demanded him, and Alexander had already walked too far to turn back. But in the quiet, private moments, a question began to rise, a question that would not be silenced. Was the price of everything truly worth it? The storm outside finally subsided. The city lights softened, and Alexander realized he had not yet faced the final reckoning. The morning came quietly, no storm, no thunder, just the pale light spilling over the city, softening the edges of skyscrapers Alexander had once ruled from above. He stood by the window, hands resting on the glass, feeling the hum of the city beneath him. The empire he had built stretched in every direction. Fortunes, headlines, influence, all undeniable, and yet he felt a strange emptiness. Years of ambition, of obedience to an unseen force, had brought him here. Yet here was not triumph. Here was a reckoning. The Pact had shaped everything. Every victory, every betrayal, every subtle manipulation. It had guided him to heights others only dreamed of. But the cost had been written in quiet moments, in fractured friendships, in lost love, in solitude. Alexander had a choice. He could continue, following the invisible path laid out for him, or he could finally break it. Risk everything. Risk the empire, the wealth, the name he had fought to define. He closed his eyes, felt the years of sacrifice, the nights spent alone, the weight of decisions that had not truly been his own, and then he made the choice. The empire did not crumble, the headlines did not collapse, but the invisible strings began to loosen. Decisions that had once been orchestrated now rested, entirely on his shoulders. A terrifying freedom, long-lost autonomy. Alexander began to rebuild. Not the empire, it was already unstoppable, but the man. He reached out to family, first cautiously, then fully. He repaired friendships. He sought love, not as a calculation, but as a surrender. It was not instant. It was not easy. Every relationship carried scars, every heartache a shadow of past compromise. But for the first time, Alexander Vale made choices for himself, not for the Pact, not for power, not for acclaim. He walked through the halls of Vale Industries differently now. The offices, once sterile and strategic, now felt like a place he could inhabit fully. Employees noticed the change. The energy in meetings shifted. People smiled without suspicion. Trust became possible again. He never saw the stranger again. The note was gone, and yet Alexander understood. Freedom had always been his to claim, if he dared. There was a final reckoning in his mind. He thought of every decision the Pact had influenced, every opportunity, every gain, every subtle manipulation, and he forgave himself. Not for what had been done, but for the choice he made now. Publicly, Alexander remained the visionary, the billionaire, the untouchable icon. Privately, he became something rarer. A man who understood the value of choice. A man who measured success not by wealth but by integrity, love, and connection. He raised a glass that evening, alone, as lightning, long absent, splintered briefly across the sky. Not in fury, but as if acknowledging the storm past. To life, he whispered. To choices. To freedom. The city stretched below, indifferent, alive, beautiful. Alexander no longer saw it as a network of power and conquest. He saw it as possibility, as potential, as a canvas on which he could finally paint with his own hand. And in that moment, he understood the truth. The Pact had changed him. It had shaped his journey, but it had not defined his legacy. Legacy, he realized, was not measured in billions, deals, or accolades. Legacy was measured in courage, in redemption, in the ability to reclaim one's life. Alexander Vale turned from the window. The office was quiet. The empire continued to hum. But he moved differently now. He spoke differently. He lived differently. For the first time, the man the world admired and feared felt whole. And the storm, the Pact, the invisible hand, they were no longer masters of his fate. They were lessons, echoes of a journey that had brought him here. The city lights glimmered. A new day had begun, and Alexander Vale smiled. Not for power, not for wealth, but for the life he finally owned.
Subscribe to my channel.